My reflection stopped blinking 18 years ago. That's when the desert horror I unleashed in 2006 Iraq truly began to hunt me. In the village of death, we found something ancient, something that stole life and defied bullets. It didn't stay buried, and it's still hungry. The year was 2006, and the Iraqi desert wasn't just hot. It was a living, breathing oven that night, exhaling a dry, choking heat that felt fundamentally wrong. Every breath tasted like iron and grit, a metallic tang on the tongue that became a constant companion. We were a part of the 2nd Reconnaissance Battalion, United States Army, slogging through the endless, shifting sands somewhere between the ancient, war-torn city of Mosul and the historical heartland of Tikrit. Our mission, as it had been countless times before, sounded simple on paper: secure a series of tunnels buried deep beneath a cluster of crumbling ruins. The locals, in hushed, fearful tones, called the place Al-Qarya al-Maut, the village of death. I was Sergeant First Class Ben McMillan back then, but everyone just called me Mac. I'd seen my share of dusty ruins and forgotten places, but Al-Qarya al-Maut had a different vibe. Even from a distance, the place exuded a sense of heavy, ancient dread that made the hairs on my neck stand up. It wasn't the usual tension of an ambush, the constant hum of vigilance that defines a combat zone. This was older, deeper, like the desert itself held its breath. Our intel briefings were pretty standard. Satellite imagery had shown unusual thermal signatures emanating from the ruins at night. Command, ever practical, figured it was a hidden insurgent cell, maybe stockpiling weapons or using the underground network to move unmolested. Insurgents were a known evil, a calculable threat. This, however, felt different. I remember PFC Morales, our youngest guy, barely out of high school, trying to make a joke about ghosts from some old Persian war. Nobody laughed. The silence spoke volumes. "Just another Tuesday, boys," Lieutenant Miller had said, trying to lighten the mood as we prepped our gear. Miller was a West Point grad, by the book, a good leader, but even he had that tightly wound look in his eyes. He'd seen enough to know that nothing in Iraq was ever just another Tuesday. We were 8 men. Miller, myself, Morales, Specialist Johnson, Sergeant Davies, and 3 other guys whose faces blur in the haze of what came next. 8 men, armed to the teeth, ready for anything human. We rolled out in our HMMWVs under the last sliver of twilight, the setting sun painting the sky in fiery streaks that seemed to mock the impending darkness. The air grew still, unnaturally so, as if the desert itself was holding its breath in anticipation. You could feel the weight of centuries pressing down on you, a history written in sand and blood that stretched back long before any of us were born. The ruins, when we finally reached them, were just a skeletal outline against the deepening indigo sky. Crumbling mud brick structures, arches that defied gravity, and a central mound of what looked like a collapsed ziggurat. It was a silent testament to a forgotten civilization, now a magnet for shadows. The local villagers had been a goldmine of information, or so our intel brief claimed. They spoke of the ruins with a reverence born of profound fear, warning us to stay away. Since months, the villagers avoid approaching, our translator had relayed, his voice tinged with genuine apprehension. They whispered stories of a malevolent presence, of shadows that moved on their own, of a deep hunger that stirred beneath the ancient stones. Miller had dismissed it as local superstition, standard fare for a population living in fear of both the enemy and the unknown. But even as he spoke, I saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes, a shared uneasiness that we all felt but dared not voice. As we dismounted, the desert wind, usually a constant companion, had completely died. The air was thick, heavy, pressing down on us like a physical weight. The silence was absolute, save for the crunch of our boots on the ancient, cracked earth and the faint hum of our equipment. My night vision goggles felt heavy on my helmet, a technological marvel against an ancient dread. It was just before dawn, that eerie hour when the world feels suspended between night and day, a liminal space where anything feels possible. We formed up, weapons at the ready, the beam of Miller's tactical flashlight cutting a stark swathe through the gloom. The entrance to the tunnels was a narrow, jagged maw in the side of the central mound, looking less like an entrance and more like a wound in the earth. It seemed to exhale a chilling coldness, a stark contrast to the stifling desert heat around us. And that's when I felt it, a faint shiver, not from the cold but from something far more primal. We were about to step into something that our training, our weapons, our very understanding of the world could not prepare us for. The village of death was about to live up to its name. We stacked up 2 by 2, a tight formation as we prepared to breach the maw. The air grew colder, each step deeper into the earth feeling like a descent into some forgotten, unholy crypt. The ground beneath our boots was not just cracked stone, it was a patchwork of jagged, ancient rock, etched with symbols that seemed to writhe and twist in the faint green glow of our night vision. Eyes not human, but almond-shaped and elongated with stark, empty pupils. Broken moons, crescent shapes with sharp, almost predatory points, and lines, thousands of them, intertwining like ancient script, but without any discernible pattern, just a chaotic, unsettling visual cacophony. It was like walking on a giant, terrifying piece of abstract art, an artwork painted by a deranged mind from a civilization lost to time. Keep it tight, fellas. Johnson, you're on point with the thermal. Miller, your tail end, Charlie. I hissed into my comms, my voice sounding unnervingly loud in the suffocating silence. Even the clatter of our gear seemed muffled, absorbed by the thick, heavy air. The tunnels themselves were claustrophobic, narrow passages that forced us to move in single file at times, making our tactical formation feel utterly useless. The walls were rough-hewn, crudely carved from the earth, but the symbols continued, snaking up the stone like ancient vines, always watching. The feeling of being observed, even in the absolute absence of any visible threat, was overwhelming. Our night vision should have turned the gloom into a perfectly navigable landscape, a stark, green-tinged reality. But here, the interior seemed to absorb the light, sucking it away into an abyss. The goggles struggled, flickering occasionally, as if the darkness itself was fighting back, refusing to yield to technology. It wasn't just a lack of light, it was an active absence, a void that pushed back against our senses. The beams of our weapon-mounted flashlights, usually powerful enough to cut through any shadow, felt weak, pathetic, barely illuminating a few feet ahead of us before dissolving into the encroaching black. Then came the smell. It hit us like a physical blow, a dense, cloying odor that permeated everything. It was the scent of decay, yes, but not like anything any of us had ever encountered. Not the sweet, sickly smell of fresh blood, nor the putrid stench of battlefield casualties left too long in the sun. This was ancient. It was the smell of meat that had died centuries ago and still hadn't quite finished rotting. A dry, dusty, metallic smell, mixed with something profoundly organic and utterly foul. Like old dried blood mixed with sulfur and forgotten things. It was the smell of death, but stretched out over eons, a lingering breath of corruption. Specialist Johnson, our thermal guy, let out a low grunt. Nothing, Sarge. No heat signatures, not even a mouse. It's colder than a witch's tit down here. His voice was forced, a little too loud, trying to cut through the mounting tension. But his thermal camera, usually our eyes in the dark, was just displaying a flat, uniform blue-black, a blank canvas of nothingness. The very air seemed to defy the laws of physics, dampening sound, absorbing light, and chilling us to the bone despite the desert heat outside. The thought hammered home. This wasn't a natural place. This wasn't some insurgent hideout. This was something else entirely. Morales, who was directly behind me, audibly swallowed. I could hear the faint click of his weapon's safety being disengaged, a nervous tick. He wasn't the only one. The unspoken fear was a tangible presence, pressing in from all sides, heavier than the packs on our backs. We were trained soldiers, hardened by combat, but this was different. This wasn't a firefight, this was a desecration. We were trespassers in a place that had long forgotten the living, a place that resonated with an ancient, malevolent energy. "Keep moving." Miller's voice, though firm, had an edge to it. He was trying to project confidence, but even his steps seemed a little heavier, a little more deliberate. The tunnels snaked downward, a slow, relentless spiral into the Earth's belly. Each turn brought more of the bizarre symbols, more of the suffocating darkness, and more of that ancient, stomach-churning stench. We moved in a kind of waking trance, our senses overloaded, our instincts screaming at us to turn back. But orders were orders, and we were soldiers. We pushed forward, deeper into the suffocating embrace of Al-Qarya al-Maut, oblivious to the fact that we were not just entering a physical space, but breaching a threshold into something far more horrifying. The weight of the world, of all its unspoken fears, seemed to settle on our shoulders, and I knew, with a gut-wrenching certainty, that we had already crossed a line we could never uncross. The village of death was only just beginning to show its true colors. We pressed on, the descent steeper now, the air growing even heavier, thick and unmoving. It felt like walking through treacle, every step an effort. The strange symbols on the walls intensified, becoming more intricate, more aggressive, drawing our eyes even against our will. It was like they were reaching out, trying to convey some ancient, forgotten message of terror. The stench of ancient decay grew stronger, too, making it difficult to breathe without gagging, a coppery, sweet smell that clung to the back of the throat. We were definitely entering the second level, a deeper layer of these subterranean nightmares. "How much further, Miller?" Sergeant Davies, usually stoic, asked, his voice tight. "My comms are getting squirrely." It was then that it happened. Not a gradual fade, not a crackle into silence, but an abrupt, total cutoff. The reassuring hiss of our comms, the vital link to the outside world, instantly vanished, replaced by nothing but the loudest, most deafening static. It wasn't just my radio. It was everyone's. I could hear the frantic clicks and adjustments from the guys around me, their frustrated grunts echoing in the sudden, eerie silence. My own comms were dead, just a blast of white noise. "Check your comms, team. Report," Miller barked, his voice betraying a hint of panic now. No response, just static. We tried everything. Frequency changes, battery checks, manual overrides, nothing. The radios, usually our lifeline, were useless, spitting nothing but a furious, churning static that sounded less like mechanical interference and more like a furious, guttural roar from the void. It was an isolation so profound, it was almost physical, severing us from everything we knew, everything that was safe. We were truly alone down here, swallowed whole by the earth. And then, amidst that maddening static, cutting through it like a rusty blade, I heard it. A sound that froze the blood in my veins, that made every muscle in my body lock up tight. A breath. Deep. Labored. Not a human breath, not an animal's. Something impossibly vast, impossibly ancient, filling the silence between the bursts of static. It was a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once, reverberating directly inside my skull, bypassing my ears entirely. A resonating vibration, a whisper of a colossal lung expanding and contracting in the suffocating darkness. PFC Morales, right behind me, stumbled, his M4 clattering against the stone wall. He'd heard it too. His eyes, wide and terrified, met mine in the dim green glow of our night vision. "Echo, must be an echo," he stammered, his voice thin, barely a whisper, but his body trembled violently, a tremor that I could feel even through the air, vibrating through the soles of my boots. He wasn't trying to convince me. He was trying to convince himself. The sound was too distinct, too intimate to be an echo. It felt like something was breathing with us, around us, through us. Lieutenant Miller, who'd been trying to get a signal on his own radio, snapped his head up. He'd heard it. The color drained from his face, leaving it a sickly pale green under the night vision. His jaw was clenched so tight I could see the muscles jumping. He knew. We all knew. This wasn't an echo. This was something else. Something awake. The silence that followed the static was even worse. A thick, oppressive blanket that felt like it was pressing on our eardrums, suffocating us. Every rustle of our gear, every shift of weight, seemed magnified, echoing endlessly in the absolute void. The sense of isolation transformed into something far more sinister, the feeling of being hunted. "All right, stay calm," Miller finally managed, his voice a strained rasp. "We stick to the plan. We find a secure location, try to re-establish comms. Keep your eyes open, and your fingers loose on the trigger." He didn't sound convincing. His words were boilerplate, the kind of things you say when you have no other answers. But what were we supposed to do when the enemy wasn't something you could shoot? Wasn't something that even registered on thermal? Wasn't something that operated by any rules we understood? The air grew perceptibly colder again. Even though the overall stifling heat of the tunnels persisted, it was a cold that seemed to emanate from within us, a terror-induced chill that seeped into our bones. The symbols on the walls, previously just unsettling, now seemed to pulse, to shift in our peripheral vision, like hundreds of unblinking eyes watching our every move. The ancient stench of decay intensified, making my stomach churn, a bitter taste rising in my throat. We moved forward, but it was no longer a tactical advance. It was a desperate shuffle, our shoulders hunched, our eyes darting into every shadow, expecting the unknown to spring out at any moment. The breath, that vast, ancient breath, seemed to resonate deeper now, a low thrumming that was both felt and heard, a vibration in the very core of our being. We were deep in the belly of the beast now, completely cut off, utterly alone. And the beast was awake. It was watching, and it was breathing. And something told me, with a certainty that chilled me to the marrow, that its next breath would be a very long time coming for us. The ominous silence that followed the comms failure, and that impossibly deep breath was a heavy shroud, muffling our movements, amplifying our fear. We continued our slow, agonizing descent, each step a testament to a dwindling hope. The symbols on the walls seemed to press closer, their carved eyes following us, and the air itself felt heavy, thick with unseen presences. The metallic tang in the air mixed with the cloying sweetness of decay, a truly stomach-churning combination. Then we rounded a sharp bend in the tunnel, and the passage opened into a vast, cavernous chamber. Our flashlights, now struggling even more against the oppressive darkness, swept across a sight that instantly extinguished any lingering pretense of this being a conventional mission. The chamber was a charnel house, a grotesque tableau of unimaginable horror. Piled haphazardly, like macabre firewood, were human remains. Not skeletons picked clean by time and scavengers, nor the grisly, fresh carnage of a recent firefight. These were different. Many of the bodies were ancient, mummified, their skin pulled taut over bone like sun-baked parchment, faces frozen in silent, agonizing screams. Their mouths were agape, eyes sunk in hollows, limbs twisted into unnatural positions. They looked like they had been subjected to some horrific, accelerating drying process, their life force utterly leached away. But what truly made our guts twist were the others. Scattered among the ancient husks were bodies that appeared eerily recent. They wore tattered remnants of clothing that looked suspiciously like contemporary attire, perhaps even military issue from other forces in the region. These bodies, too, were bone dry. No blood, not a single drop, stained the cracked stone floor or their desiccated skin. Their eyes, though still somewhat intact, were cloudy, glazed over, staring blankly at nothing. Their faces held the same expression of silent agony as the older mummies, as if life had been sucked out of them in a single, agonizing gasp. The skin on these newer victims was a pale, grayish white, clinging to their frames like forgotten cellophane, every tendon and bone sharply delineated. They were like hollowed-out statues of men, perfectly preserved in their final, terrifying moments. "What the hell?" Johnson whispered, his voice cracking, his thermal unit hanging uselessly from his hand. His face was green, his eyes wide with revulsion. Morales choked back a gasp, clutching his rifle so tightly his knuckles were white. Even Miller, usually unflappable, stood frozen, his flashlight beam trembling slightly as it swept over the horrifying scene. This wasn't insurgents. No known group, no method of warfare could produce this. This was something else. Something ancient, something monstrous had been here, and was perhaps still here. "Form a perimeter, careful," Miller finally snapped, his voice rough. "Keep your weapons up, don't touch anything." His order was almost redundant. None of us wanted to get any closer to that grotesque pile. The smell here was overwhelming. The ancient decay mingled with a fresh, sterile yet foul odor, like a surgical room after something truly alien had been dissected. It was the scent of absence, the smell of life that had been forcefully extracted. My gaze was drawn to one of the newer bodies. It lay sprawled near the edge of the pile, a young man, his face locked in a rictus of terror. He might have been one of us, a soldier from another unit or even a local. His uniform, though shredded, had markings that looked like a coalition force. He was as dry as a desert leaf, his skin like tissue paper. Curiosity, morbid and terrifying, warred with my instinct to retreat. I raised my M4, keeping my aim steady, and cautiously extended my boot, gently nudging the body. It was unnervingly light, like a bundle of dry sticks. As my boot made contact, something shifted. Not just the body, but something within it. The jaw, which had been locked in that silent scream, suddenly dropped open with a soft, sickening click. It wasn't muscle reflex. It was deliberate, an uncanny, almost desperate movement. The mouth opened wider, wider, as if still trying to take a breath, still trying to scream, still trying to suck in the life that had been so cruelly stolen from it. No sound came out, just an empty, cavernous blackness. But the sheer impossibility of it, the lingering, unnatural hunger in that motion made my blood run cold. I recoiled instinctively, stumbling back a step, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Hold on, it moved!" I yelled, my voice a strangled shout. And that was when we heard it for the first time. Not the breathing from the static. This was something else entirely. A low, guttural sound, deep in the throat of something impossibly large. It was a growl, yes, a ferocious rumble that vibrated through the very stone of the chamber, shaking our teeth in our skulls. But it was also a lament, a long, drawn-out moan of profound, ancient sorrow. It was a sound that shouldn't exist, a terrifying symphony of predator and victim, of hunger and despair. It came from the deepest, darkest recesses of the chamber, from a tunnel entrance we hadn't noticed, a gaping black maw that seemed to stare back at us. The air grew frigid, and the stench of iron and ancient decay spiked, making me gasp for air. We weren't alone. We were the next course. The growl lament echoed, a primal shriek that seemed to tear at the fabric of the ancient tunnels. It wasn't just a sound. It was a physical force vibrating through the ground, up our boots and into our very bones. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, and the blood thrummed in my ears, drowning out everything but the deafening fear. Miller, ever the commander, snapped out of his trance. "Perimeter, form a damn perimeter! Weapons up, steady!" he bellowed, his voice tight, but the command was clear. We instinctively pivoted, rifles raised, aiming into the blackness from which the sound had emanated. Our flashlights, now seeming ridiculously inadequate, stabbed at the oppressive gloom, trying to pierce the veil of shadow that seemed to swallow their feeble light. The fear was a living thing in the chamber now, coiling around us, suffocating. Every instinct screamed to run, but our training for a few precious seconds held us rigid. Specialist Johnson's thermal scanner, which had been stubbornly blank, suddenly flickered. "Movement! Something just moved! Low profile, Sarge! Coming from that tunnel!" His voice was a strained whisper, laced with pure terror. But the image on his screen was blurry, distorted, as if the thermal energy itself was being warped. Or perhaps the creature simply wasn't emitting enough heat to register clearly. We strained our eyes, peering into the inky blackness. Nothing. The shadow seemed impenetrable. Our night vision goggles, usually so effective, were struggling again, producing a grainy, distorted image. The air grew colder, a bone-chilling cold that had nothing to do with the desert's ambient temperature, a cold that felt like it was leaching the warmth directly from our bodies. Then, just as doubt began to creep in, questioning if it was real, if it was just our minds playing tricks in this ancient tomb, it appeared. A silhouette. Humanoid, yes, but bent, distorted, its form too elongated, too angular to be truly human. It wasn't walking or crawling in a conventional sense. It seemed to flow along the uneven stone wall of the tunnel, a dark, undulating shadow that moved with an unnatural, almost liquid grace. It was fast, terrifyingly fast, a blur of motion at the very edge of our perception. Our flashlights, still struggling, caught it for a split second, illuminating fragments of its horrifying form. Its skin, or what we could see of it, was a pallid grayish-white, taut and glistening in the dim light. It was utterly devoid of hair, smooth and slick like a freshly peeled cadaver. Its limbs were too long, too spindly, ending in hands that seemed to have too many fingers, tipped with what looked like razor-sharp claws. It moved with a disturbing, disjointed rhythm, like a spider skittering across a web, defying gravity as it clung to the wall. But it was its eyes that truly seared themselves into my memory, an image that would haunt my waking hours for decades. They weren't red, like the reflective eyes of an animal caught in a spotlight. They were a chilling, pure white, luminous and devoid of pupils like polished bone. They didn't just reflect the light, they seemed to emit it. Two searing pinpricks of icy white that glowed with an ancient predatory intelligence. Those eyes locked onto us, and in them I saw an emptiness so vast, so ancient, it threatened to swallow my very soul. They weren't the eyes of an insurgent. They weren't the eyes of any creature I'd ever seen. They were the eyes of something that lived in the deepest nightmares, something that understood hunger on a cosmic scale. A collective gasp ripped through our group. Fear, raw and primal, erupted. It was no longer a quiet dread. It was a screaming panic, a fight-or-flight instinct that overwhelmed years of military discipline. Morales let out a choked cry, his finger already on the trigger. "Fire! Fire!" Miller roared, his voice cracking with desperation. And we did. All at once. A cacophony of gunfire erupted, the muzzle flashes blinding in the suffocating darkness, the deafening roar of our M4s echoing off the stone walls. Tracer rounds, usually bright streaks, were swallowed almost instantly by the oppressive gloom, barely illuminating the horror we were unleashing our fury upon. The creature, caught in the sudden barrage, writhed. It wasn't a human reaction. It was a sickening, unnatural contortion, its spindly limbs thrashing as if possessed by a seizure. Rounds slammed into its pale gray form, tearing at its flesh, but it didn't fall. It didn't even slow. Instead, its movements became even more erratic, more impossibly fast. It was like trying to hit smoke or a phantom. The bullets seemed to pass through it or glance off, having no discernible effect beyond making it twist and shriek, a sound like grinding stone and tearing metal that grated on our nerves. And then it launched itself, not from the wall, but off it, seeming to float through the air, impossibly light, impossibly swift. It darted between the blinding muzzle flashes, a pale blur in the chaos, a predatory shadow moving with impossible speed. It was too fast. Before any of us could even react, before the reality of its speed could fully register, it was among us, a terrifying, silent whirlwind of pale limbs and bone-white eyes. It moved with an ethereal grace, a dance of death. I saw it lunge, a terrifying blur, at Specialist Johnson. He didn't even have time to scream. The creature's elongated hand, tipped with those terrible claws, moved with a speed that defied perception, a sickening wet sound like a suction cup detaching too quickly. Johnson dropped, a marionette with its strings cut, his eyes wide, already glazing over. His neck was torn open, but there was no geyser of blood, no crimson spray. Just a dark, dry crevice in his flesh, the sickening sound of something being drawn out. Then it moved again, a flash of white eyes, and Sergeant Davies was next. A muffled gurgle, a sudden collapse. 2 men down in seconds, their life force stolen, leaving behind only dry, collapsing husks where vital, breathing soldiers had stood moments before. The reality of it was worse than any bullet wound, any explosion. It was a complete, horrifying erasure. Panic, pure and untamed, erupted in the chamber, shattering our fragile discipline. The growl lament echoed again, a triumphant, hungry sound. The creature moved like a ghost, a blur of pale flesh and those searing white eyes. It was a predator designed for these tunnels, a nightmare brought to life in the suffocating dark. Panic, pure and unadulterated, ripped through the remaining men, tearing away the thin veneer of military discipline we'd clung to so desperately. 2 of our own, Johnson and Davies, lay on the ancient stone, their bodies already shriveling, their life force stolen in a flash. There was no blood, no gruesome splatter, just the horrifying, dry, sucked-out stillness of death. The silence from their forms was more terrifying than any scream. My M4 was still spitting lead, the muzzle flash momentarily illuminating the creature's horrifying dance. I emptied the magazine, a desperate, visceral reaction to the terror, the adrenaline coursing through my veins like ice water. I watched horrified as round after round slammed into its gaunt frame, tearing away chunks of flesh, leaving pale, grayish divots. But it didn't slow. It didn't even flinch. It simply contorted, twisting its impossibly flexible body, a mockery of vulnerability. It seemed to absorb the impact, to welcome the bullets, or perhaps they simply didn't harm it in any way that mattered. It was like shooting at a shadow, a tangible entity that defied all known physics. Its bone-white eyes, those twin points of predatory light, seemed to fix on me for a terrifying second. In that fleeting moment, I felt something ancient, malevolent, and utterly hungry pierce my very being. A cold dread seeped into my soul, a sense of absolute powerlessness. This thing wasn't just a monster, it was an apex predator from another dimension of fear. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. One moment, its wraith-like form was darting between the remaining members of our squad, its terrible claws poised. The next, it had simply vanished. Vanished into the shadows that seemed to coil and writhe at the edges of our flashlight beams, becoming one with the oppressive darkness. It left no trace, no sound, just a profound, chilling absence. The silence that followed was even more deafening than the gunfire. A heavy, suffocating silence pregnant with terror. We were left with the lingering stench of ancient decay, the coppery taste of fear in our mouths, and the horrifying sight of our fallen comrades, now nothing more than desiccated husks. Lieutenant Miller, despite the palpable fear in his voice, tried to regain control. "Regroup, form up, Mac, perimeter check, Morales, cover fire," he barked, his commands frayed at the edges. But his words were lost, swallowed by the sheer, unadulterated panic that had now fully consumed us. Our unit, usually a well-oiled machine, was broken. The discipline we had trained for, the camaraderie forged in countless engagements, had evaporated in the face of this unthinkable horror. The remaining men were scattering, their eyes wide with a terror that transcended fear of death. They were running, stumbling, blindly firing into the darkness, their movements erratic and desperate. Some screamed, high-pitched, guttural cries of pure, primal terror. Others whimpered, their pleas lost in the echoes of the tunnels. They were not running from something. They were running into something, into the unknown depths of Alcaria al-Maut. I saw Corporal Martinez, a tough Marine from Texas, drop his rifle and scramble away, crawling on his hands and knees, his eyes unfocused, a stream of incoherent pleas escaping his lips. Private Thompson, normally a cool-headed sniper, was spinning in circles, firing wildly into the rock walls, his face contorted in a mask of madness. The creature hadn't needed to kill us all physically. It had simply broken our minds, scattering us like frightened mice. Miller saw it too, the unraveling of his command, the descent into chaos. His face was pale, streaked with sweat, his eyes darting between the vanishing figures of his men and the oppressive darkness. He tried to rally them, tried to shout out orders, but his voice was swallowed by the terror, his words useless against the creeping madness. "Fall back! Fall back to the surface!" he screamed, his voice raw with desperation, a final, desperate gambit to escape the nightmare. He turned, pointing his flashlight back the way we came, towards what he hoped was the exit, but even as he did, I felt a profound sense of dread. The path we had taken, the tunnels we had navigated just moments before, now seemed unfamiliar, alien. The walls themselves seemed to ripple, to shift, the very stone breathing in and out, distorting the familiar passages. We ran, not as a unit, but as individuals, driven by an instinct for survival that had been stripped bare of all other considerations. We scrambled over the rough-hewn stone, pushing past each other, gasping for air that felt thick and stale. The air itself seemed to pulse, to move in concert with the shifting walls, as if the entire structure of Al-Qarya al-Maut was a living, breathing entity, flexing its muscles, closing its maw around us. The symbols on the walls seemed to writhe and contort, their carved eyes following our frantic, desperate flight. The guttural growl lament echoed again, a sound of triumphant hunger that reverberated directly inside our skulls, driving us deeper into madness. We were no longer soldiers on a mission. We were simply prey, running blind into the labyrinthine maw of something ancient, something that had finally awakened. And it was still hungry. The escape attempt was a desperate, panicked charge into a nightmare. We ran, or rather stumbled, through the twisting, suffocating tunnels, our discipline shattered, our minds frayed. The lieutenant's frantic cries of this way," were swallowed by the echoing darkness, becoming meaningless against the overwhelming sense of disorientation. The path back to the surface, the way we had so cautiously descended, was no longer there. The tunnels had changed. It wasn't a trick of the light or a disorientation caused by panic. The very architecture of the subterranean complex seemed to defy logic and memory. Passages we were certain we'd taken were now walled off by rough, newly formed rock. Familiar landmarks had vanished, replaced by smooth, uncarved stone or by new branching corridors that coiled deeper into the earth. It was as if the place itself was alive, shifting its internal organs, adjusting its maw to swallow us whole. The walls, previously cold and unyielding, now seemed to pulse, to breathe with a slow, deliberate rhythm. I could swear I saw the rough-hewn stone ripple, expanding and contracting almost imperceptibly, as if the entire structure was a gargantuan organic being. The air grew thicker, heavier, clinging to our skin like a shroud, and the stench of iron and ancient decay intensified with every step, making it hard to draw a clean breath. Every shadow seemed to coalesce, to take on monstrous forms, and the echoes of our own terrified gasps sounded like the whispers of unseen things closing in. Hours passed, or perhaps days. Time became meaningless in that suffocating darkness. Our watches, which had been perfectly functional moments before the comms went out, now displayed erratic numbers, then simply froze, their digital displays dead, their batteries mysteriously drained. The cold, logical progression of time had simply ceased to exist. We were trapped in a timeless void, a pocket dimension of pure, unadulterated fear. Our flashlights, once powerful beacons, flickered weakly, then died one by one, their batteries mysteriously depleted. The night vision goggles, too, gave up the ghost, their green-tinged reality dissolving into absolute blackness. We were plunged into a profound, suffocating darkness, a darkness so absolute it felt like a physical weight, pressing in on our eyeballs, making us feel as if we were losing our sight. Only the faint, almost imperceptible glow of Miller's tactical light remained, a pathetic beacon against the encroaching void. We kept moving, a primal urge to escape driving us forward, even though we had no idea where we were going. The panic had morphed into a dull, agonizing ache, a persistent thrum of terror that settled deep in our bones. We stumbled over unseen obstacles, scraped our hands and faces on the rough-hewn walls, our uniforms torn and caked with dust and grime. Our water ran out. Our rations became inedible due to the fear and the metallic taste that coated our tongues. We became disoriented, delirious from fear, thirst, and the sheer psychological onslaught of the tunnels. The screams, the whimperings, the panicked shots that had marked our initial flight had long since faded. The other men, Thompson, Martinez, and the rest, they were gone. Swallowed by the shifting labyrinth or taken by the creature, we didn't know. We didn't dare think about it. The silence now was profound, broken only by our ragged breathing, our thumping hearts, and the drip, drip, drip of unseen moisture somewhere in the distance. Finally, only 3 of us remained: Lieutenant Miller, PFC Morales, and me. 3 men against an ancient, shifting nightmare. Morales, the youngest, his face smeared with grime and tears, was barely holding on. He stumbled constantly, muttering to himself, his eyes vacant. Miller, though outwardly tougher, had a desperate, haunted look in his eyes, his grip on his rifle so tight his knuckles were white. And me, McMillan, I felt a terrifying emptiness growing inside, a cold resolve that bordered on madness. We were just automatons now, driven by the sheer, animalistic will to survive. The tunnels continued their cruel deception, leading us deeper, never offering a glimmer of hope or an exit. The air, though suffocating, was strangely still, not a hint of a breeze. It was like being entombed alive. Every shadow felt like a hiding place for the entity, every distant echo a sign of its impending return. We were no longer soldiers on a mission. We were rats in a maze, and the maze was playing with its food. And as we plunged deeper into the earth, I knew, with a horrifying certainty, that the physical torment was just the beginning. The tunnels were doing something to us, something far more insidious than simply killing us. They were changing us. The unrelenting march through the ever-shifting labyrinth continued, a slow, agonizing descent into madness. Our bodies screamed in protest, but our minds, already fractured, urged us onward. Morales, especially, was fading fast, his youthful optimism replaced by a hollow-eyed, trembling despair. His complexion had taken on a sickly, grayish pallor, and his lips were cracked and bleeding. It began subtly at first, almost imperceptibly. Small, dark bruises appearing on our skin in places where we hadn't hit ourselves, odd discolorations that spread like ink blots. I noticed them on my forearms, then on my chest, faint smudges that weren't painful but were profoundly unsettling. Miller had similar marks, though he tried to dismiss them as impacts from bumping against the walls in the dark. But we knew. This wasn't just physical exhaustion or clumsy accidents. This was something else. Then came the marks. Thinner, darker lines like veins, but black, not blue, appearing just beneath the surface of our skin. They weren't veins, they were too erratic, too sharp, like intricate, dark calligraphy etched under our flesh. They pulsed faintly, as if something alien was flowing just beneath our skin. Mine started on my left arm, snaking up from my wrist towards my elbow, a stark contrast against my pale skin. Miller had them too, a network spreading across his neck and jawline, making his face look even more gaunt and sinister in the dim light. Morales, however, was affected the worst. His entire body seemed to be riddled with them, black lines webbing across his face, his exposed arms, even his eyelids. He began to cough, a dry, hacking sound that soon evolved into something far more alarming. He would double over, racked by violent spasms, and then he would vomit. Not bile, not stomach contents, but thick, dark, viscous blood. It was like crude oil, almost black, congealing immediately upon hitting the dusty stone floor. The smell was like rust and something else, something deeply metallic and ancient. "Morales, you gotta rest, man," I urged, trying to help him up after one particularly brutal bout. His body felt unnervingly light, his skin clammy and cold. He shook his head weakly. His eyes, though clouded with pain and fever, still held a spark of desperate resolve. No, Sarge. Gotta keep moving. Gotta get out. Gotta... His voice trailed off into a dry, rasping cough. He insisted on walking, on pushing forward, even as his strength ebbed, even as his body visibly withered. It was as if some unseen force was driving him, compelling him forward, despite the obvious physical collapse. He was a man possessed, or perhaps a man slowly being consumed. The marks, the bleeding, the growing weakness, it wasn't just physical. There was a psychological component too. Morales started having vivid hallucinations, muttering about figures in the shadows, about whispers that only he could hear. He spoke of the tunnels calling to him, of voices that promised release if he just gave in. Miller and I tried to comfort him, to tell him it was the dehydration, the exhaustion, but in our hearts, we knew better. We were seeing the same shadows, hearing the same whispers, only we were fighting harder to deny them. Our own bodies were betraying us too. The constant metallic taste in my mouth, the creeping chill in my bones that no amount of exertion could dispel, the unshakable feeling of being watched, from both without and within. I would occasionally catch my reflection in a darkened surface, or in a momentary pool of water, and see the black marks spreading on my own skin, the hollowed-out look in my eyes. I was changing. We all were. The entity hadn't just attacked us physically. It was slowly, insidiously infecting us, tainting our very essence. The tunnels, which had initially just disoriented us, now seemed to actively manipulate our minds. Pathways would appear and disappear. Faint lights would flicker in the distance only to vanish as we approached. Sounds of distant footsteps, of whispers, of low, guttural growls would echo, just beyond the edge of our hearing, playing on our deepest fears. We were lost, trapped in a shifting psychological prison, and our bodies were becoming canvases for the horror. One night, or what we perceived as night in that timeless void, Morales collapsed again, gasping for air, the thick, dark blood frothing at his lips. He clutched his chest, his eyes wide, staring at something only he could see in the oppressive darkness. "It's inside," he croaked, his voice barely audible. It's taking my breath." He then fell silent, his body convulsing violently for a few more agonizing seconds before going completely still. His eyes remained wide open, staring up at the unseen ceiling, a terrifying mirror of the dead in the chamber above. Miller and I looked at each other, our faces etched with utter despair. We knew what it meant. We were next. The black marks on our skin seemed to deepen, to pulse with a faint malevolent light, as if in recognition of the young man's death. The air around us suddenly smelled powerfully of iron, of dry, ancient blood, and I knew with a horrifying certainty that this wasn't just a physical degradation. This was a slow, agonizing transformation, a prelude to something far worse. The tunnels were not just trying to kill us, they were trying to turn us into something else entirely. We were becoming part of their ancient, hungry landscape. Morales' death hung heavy in the suffocating air, a final, crushing blow to our morale. Miller and I exchanged a look of grim, desperate understanding. We were next. Our bodies ached, our minds were frayed, and the black, vein-like marks on our skin seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, a constant reminder of the insidious corruption spreading within us. The taste of iron was perpetual, and the ancient stench of decay was now woven into the very fabric of our being. We pushed forward, driven by a primal, animalistic will to simply not stop. To stop was to die, to surrender to the pervasive darkness and the thing that lurked within it. Our movements were labored, each step an act of defiance against the inevitable. We were no longer navigating, we were simply falling deeper, pulled by an unseen current. Then the tunnel widened again, not into another charnel chamber, but into a space that felt both sacred and profoundly blasphemous. It was vast, circular, and unlike the rough-hewn passages, this chamber was meticulously carved from a smooth, obsidian-like black stone. The walls weren't covered in random symbols, but in a series of intricate, terrifying glyphs that seemed to writhe and flow, depicting scenes of immense suffering, of figures being drained, consumed, their life force offered to something unseen. In the center of this chamber stood an altar. It wasn't built for reverence, but for sacrifice. It was a crude, brutal construction, fashioned from countless human bones, intricately interwoven and cemented together with a dark, dried substance that I instinctively knew was blood. Fragments of the same black stone as the chamber walls were embedded within the bones, glistening dully in the faint, failing beam of Miller's flashlight. The altar dominated the space, a monument to an ancient, unspeakable horror. And upon the altar, in the very heart of the chamber, rested a sarcophagus. It was unlike anything I had ever seen. Carved from a single block of the same black stone, it was massive, imposing, and covered in more of those terrifying glyphs. It radiated an aura of immense age and unspeakable power. Draped over the sarcophagus, almost reverently, was a piece of cloth. It was a deep, blood-red color, but so dry and brittle it looked like it would crumble to dust at the slightest touch. It was ancient, saturated with time, and bore the faint metallic smell of dried blood. Miller's flashlight beam, now just a weak, wavering glow, lingered on the sarcophagus. His eyes, sunken and haunted, held a desperate, almost manic glint. He had a look of wild, irrational hope, the kind born from utter despair. "We gotta check it, Mac," he rasped, his voice raw. "Weapons, intel, something, maybe it's a hidden cache. We have to know." I felt a profound sense of dread, a sickening premonition that screamed at me to turn away, to leave this place undisturbed. Every fiber of my being recoiled from the idea. This was not a place for intel or weapons. This was a tomb, a prison, a holy site for something unspeakably evil. But Miller, my superior, was beyond reason. He was clinging to the last vestiges of military protocol, a desperate attempt to impose order on a universe that had devolved into chaos. His eyes pleaded with me, a silent demand for one last, futile act of soldiering. "Lieutenant, I don't think that's a good idea," I said, my voice barely a whisper, thick with trepidation. "This feels wrong. This isn't a supply cache, sir. This is something else." He shook his head, a grim, determined set to his jaw. "We're past good ideas, Mac. We're past feeling wrong. This is our last shot. If there's a way out of here, a way to fight back, it's gotta be in there." He gestured vaguely at the sarcophagus, his hand trembling. "Orders are orders, Sergeant. Even if they're my own damn orders." He was clearly not thinking straight, his judgment clouded by fear and exhaustion. But he was still the lieutenant. And in that moment, despite the horror, I was still a soldier, bound by command. We were moments away from utter defeat, and his desperate hope, however irrational, was all we had left. We approached the altar slowly, our boots crunching on something gritty, perhaps bone dust, perhaps ancient dried blood. The air grew perceptibly colder again, even in the stifling chamber, a supernatural chill that emanated directly from the black sarcophagus. The symbols on the walls seemed to darken, to deepen, their depiction of drained figures growing more vivid, more terrifying. The stench of iron and ancient decay was overwhelming, making my eyes water and my throat burn. We reached the sarcophagus. It was smooth, cold to the touch, and radiated a faint, almost imperceptible vibration, a low hum that resonated in my chest. The red cloth, when I carefully lifted a corner, crumbled slightly, revealing more of the intricate, disturbing glyphs etched into the black stone beneath. They depicted a stylized, emaciated figure, its eyes pure white, surrounded by smaller, supplicating human forms. "Okay, Mac." "On my count," Miller said, his voice a strained whisper as he placed his hands on the massive lid. I gripped the other side, my muscles screaming in protest, the black marks on my forearms seeming to throb with a dull ache. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst through my chest. Every instinct screamed at me to stop, to run, to bury this thing deeper, but I followed the command. We were two soldiers at the end of our rope, about to pry open a door that should have remained sealed for millennia. 1, 2, 3. With a tremendous grunt, we heaved. The lid, impossibly heavy, groaned against the stone, a terrible grinding sound that echoed through the chamber, seeming to awaken every sleeping horror. Dust, thick and ancient, puffed into the air, carrying with it the overpowering stench of iron, decay, and something else. Something sharp, acrid, like ozone and dried blood. We slid the lid aside, revealing the terrifying contents within. And in that moment I knew with bone-deep certainty that we absolutely, positively should not have done that. Our foolish hope had just doomed us all. The grinding screech of the sarcophagus lid sliding open was a sound that seemed to scrape against the very foundations of the world. It tore through the oppressive silence, reverberating through the black stone chamber, and directly into the deepest parts of our minds. A cloud of ancient dust, thick and suffocating, billowed out from the opened tomb, carrying with it an odor that transcended all previous horrors. It was a potent cocktail of dried blood, ancient decay, sulfur, and something sharp, metallic, like static electricity and rust. It was the stench of something long dormant, now stirring to life. As the dust began to settle, revealing the contents within, the beam of Lieutenant Miller's failing flashlight, now barely a feeble glow, fell upon it. And there it was. Not a cache of weapons, not documents, not even a skeleton. Instead, nestled within the sarcophagus, lay a figure. It was naked, its skin a uniform, sickening grayish white, like a body that had been submerged in stagnant water for far too long, or perhaps mummified in ash. Its form was unmistakably human, but impossibly gaunt, cadaverous, its limbs long and slender, its chest a skeletal cage. Every bone, every tendon, every muscle was sharply delineated beneath the parchment-thin skin, giving it the appearance of an anatomy model meticulously crafted from dried tissue. It lay perfectly still, as if in a profound, unnatural sleep that had lasted for centuries. Then, slowly, deliberately, its eyes opened. They had no pupils, no iris, just pure, unblemished white. They weren't merely reflective, they seemed to glow with an internal light, a chilling, luminous white that pierced through the gloom, reflecting the faint beam of Miller's flashlight with an intensity that burned into my retinas. These were the same bone-white eyes we had seen on the attacking creature, the eyes that had hunted us in the tunnels, the eyes that had claimed Johnson and Davies. But these were even more unnerving, utterly devoid of any human expression, any flicker of recognition or emotion. They were simply blank, vacant. And yet they held an ancient, terrible intelligence, a cosmic emptiness that looked right through us, into the very core of our being. The creature didn't scream. It didn't move. Not a muscle twitched. It simply lay there in its black stone bed, its pure white eyes fixed on us, on Miller and me with an unblinking, horrifying gaze. And in that gaze, I felt something within me fracture. It wasn't just my composure. It was deeper than that. It felt like a piece of my soul, a fundamental part of my sanity, simply snapped and shattered, dissolving into the oppressive darkness. I felt a coldness spread through my chest, a profound despair that went beyond fear. It was the realization of absolute, undeniable evil, of a being so ancient and so powerful that our very existence was a fleeting, insignificant spark. Miller, bless his soldier's heart, reacted on pure instinct. His face, already pale, turned ashen, his mouth agape in silent horror. Then a primal scream ripped from his throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror and rage. He lifted his M4 and unleashed a desperate, full-auto burst. Breet-teet-teet-teet-teet. The muzzle flashes momentarily illuminated the chamber in blinding white, the deafening roar of the rifle echoing off the black stone walls. Rounds slammed into the creature's chest, into its head, tearing gaping holes in its grayish flesh. I saw the impacts, the tearing of tissue, the pulverization of bone. Any human being, any creature would have been torn to shreds, a mangled mess. But the creature didn't bleed, not a single drop of crimson. The bullets passed through its body, leaving ragged, empty holes, but there was no life fluid to spill. The gaping wounds simply remained, empty orifices in its cadaverous form. It didn't even twitch. It just lay there, its pure white eyes still fixed on us, utterly unmoved, utterly unharmed. It was a terrifying, impossible display of invulnerability. Then, a slow, deliberate movement. The creature's lips, or where its lips should have been, stretched back. It was a smile. A lipless, horrifying rictus that revealed not teeth, but countless razor-sharp needles, glinting wetly in the dim light. They were like the fangs of 1,000 piranhas, impossibly thin, impossibly sharp, perfectly designed for tearing and suction. It was not a smile of amusement or even malice. It was a smile of pure, ancient hunger. And then it spoke, not with its mouth, not with a voice that came from its throat. The words resonated directly inside our skulls, bypassing our ears entirely, searing themselves into our minds. It was a language none of us understood, a torrent of guttural, ancient sounds, alien and horrifying. But we felt them. We felt the meaning, the intent, the pure, corrosive evil behind each syllable. They were words that vibrated with malevolent power, words that burrowed into our brains, twisting and tearing at our sanity. They were words that spoke of unending hunger, of ancient dominion, of a feast long overdue. Words that hurt. A sickening wet cough erupted from beside me. Morales. He hadn't been dead. He had just been dormant. He crumpled to the floor, convulsing violently, his body racked by terrifying spasms. His eyes rolled back in his head, revealing only whites. And from his mouth, instead of the thick blood, a vapor began to rise. Dark, viscous, like liquid smoke, it poured from his lips, coalescing into wisps that seemed to be pulled towards the open sarcophagus, towards the creature. It wasn't just breath. It was his very essence, his life force, being drawn out of him, consumed by the awakened horror. The black marks on his skin pulsed with a furious, sickening light, as if they were conduits for this horrifying transaction. I screamed, a wordless, guttural sound of pure, unadulterated terror. My M4 was still in my hands, and I emptied the rest of my magazine, then another and another into the creature. Brat, tat, tat, tat. The sound was deafening, the flashes blinding, but it was a futile, desperate act. The bullets continued to pass through, causing no harm, drawing no blood. The creature merely watched, its lipless smile widening, its bone-white eyes radiating an awful, triumphant power. My mind screamed at me, "It's not dying. You can't kill it." This was not a physical being. This was something beyond flesh and bone, a thing of pure, ancient evil, awakened by our foolish trespass. We had not found a way out. We had simply opened the door to our own damnation. My M4 clicked empty, the last rounds expended in a desperate, futile volley. My hands were shaking so violently I almost dropped the rifle, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. The creature in the sarcophagus, its gaunt form riddled with bullet holes that refused to bleed, merely watched, its lipless smile wider now, those needle-sharp teeth glinting in the faint light. Morales lay twitching on the floor, the dark liquid smoke still pouring from his mouth, his life force visibly draining. I stared at the creature, my mind a storm of terror and utter disbelief. It wasn't just unkillable, it seemed to feed on our fear, on our futile resistance. Its bone-white eyes, those terrifying orbs of pure light, seemed to bore directly into my soul, and I felt a profound chill that had nothing to do with the air temperature. Then, a subtle shift. The creature, still unmoving, still smiling its dreadful smile, began to recoil. Or at least I thought it did. A slight lean back, a fractional retreat into the black depths of the sarcophagus. Hope, fleeting and desperate, flickered within me for a split second. Maybe, just maybe, my frantic gunfire had spooked it, had somehow repelled it. But then, the true horror unfolded. Its shadow. The creature's silhouette, projected by Miller's weak flashlight beam onto the black stone wall behind the sarcophagus, began to stir. It wasn't just a passive absence of light. It was a living, breathing entity. The shadow rippled, elongated, detaching itself from the wall with a sickening liquid grace. It was a fluid, inky darkness, a piece of pure void given malicious sentience. It writhed, expanded, and then, with terrifying speed, launched itself. Not at me, not at the creature in the sarcophagus. It darted directly at Lieutenant Miller, who stood frozen beside me, his own rifle now useless, his face a mask of abject horror. "Miller, look out!" I screamed, a raw, guttural sound of warning, but it was too late. The shadow moved with a speed that defied comprehension, a black blur that enveloped him in an instant. It wasn't an attack of claws or teeth. It was an embrace, a suffocating, consuming darkness that swallowed Miller whole. He let out a choked cry, a gurgling gasp that was quickly muffled, absorbed by the clinging shadow. I saw his body contort, writhing violently for a few agonizing seconds within the inky blackness. The air around the shadow grew frigid, intensely cold, and I felt the warmth being sucked directly out of the chamber, out of me, as if the shadow was a vacuum, draining everything it touched. Then, as suddenly as it had enveloped him, the shadow retracted. It peeled away from Miller, shrinking back, retracting its tendrils of darkness, and flowed back towards the sarcophagus, settling once more beneath the unmoving, smiling creature. What was left behind was not Miller. He stood there for a split second, swaying precariously, his uniform still clutched in the shadow's wake. His skin, which had been pale and clammy moments before, was now a desiccated, grayish white. His eyes, wide with terror, were cloudy, sunken into hollows. His mouth hung open, a silent scream frozen in place. He was dry. Utterly, completely dry. Like the ancient mummies we had seen in the upper chambers, like the recent victims. His body, once full of life and vigor, had been reduced to a husk, a brittle, lightweight shell. He was a mummy, in seconds. His rifle clattered to the ground, a hollow sound against the black stone, and then he collapsed. Not with a thud, but with a dry, papery rustle, like a pile of autumn leaves caught in a gust of wind. His form disintegrated slightly upon impact, a fine, ancient dust rising from his collapsing frame. He was gone. Another one consumed, erased, his life force stolen, his very essence devoured by the ancient hunger. The creature in the sarcophagus watched, its lipless smile unchanging, its bone-white eyes burning with a chilling satisfaction. It was not just a physical being. It was a parasitic entity that could manifest as flesh or shadow, feeding on life, on fear, on the very essence of existence. And now it had claimed my lieutenant. I was alone. Completely, utterly alone in that chamber of black stone and ancient horror, with the grinning, unkillable entity watching me, and the fresh dust of my comrades clinging to the air. My mind, already shattered, could take no more. Logic, reason, military training, all of it dissolved into a screaming primal terror. There was no fighting this thing. There was only one option left. I ran. I didn't think about where I was going, didn't think about the shifting tunnels, the labyrinthine deception. I just ran. I scrambled over the crumbling altar of bones, past Morales' convulsing form, through the narrow entrance of the chamber, and into the suffocating darkness of the tunnels beyond. My lungs burned, my legs screamed, but I ran. The creature's terrifying smile, its bone-white eyes, and the image of Miller collapsing into dust were burned into my retinas, driving me forward. I didn't care about the darkness, about getting lost, about anything. I just needed to be away from it. Away from the ancient hunger, away from the shadow that consumed. I ran until my body gave out, until consciousness deserted me, a desperate, animalistic flight from a nightmare that had become terrifyingly real. I don't remember much of what happened after that. The memory is a fractured mosaic, shards of pure terror and delirium. I recall stumbling through endless suffocating darkness, my hands raw, my clothes torn, my body screaming in protest. The air tasted like rust and fear. The black marks on my skin felt like they were burning, pulsing with a life of their own. I remember crawling more than walking, my vision blurring, my mind flitting in and out of consciousness. The growl lament, that terrifying symphony of hunger and sorrow, seemed to echo from every shadow, a constant reminder of what I was running from. Then, a sudden, blinding light. The sun. It hit my eyes like a physical blow, searing through the darkness of my pupils, making me recoil, screaming. I had somehow, miraculously, found my way to the surface. The vast, indifferent expanse of the Iraqi desert stretched before me, an endless sea of sand that seemed to swallow my terror whole. The sound of rotors, helicopters, a familiar comforting sound that normally meant salvation, but now only added to the cacophony in my shattered mind. I must have collapsed then, my body finally giving out, surrendering to the exhaustion, the dehydration, the unimaginable trauma. They found me miles away from Al-Qaria al-Maut, a lone, delirious soldier stumbling through the desert, muttering incoherently about shadows and white eyes and things that didn't bleed. I was a mess. Dehydrated to the point of collapse, malnourished, my body covered in grime, cuts, and the strange black marks that pulsed just beneath my skin. I was the sole survivor. The official reports were swift and clinical. They spoke of intense insurgent activity and a catastrophic structural collapse within the ancient tunnel network. They described a fierce engagement, heavy casualties, and a desperate struggle. There was no mention of bodies drained of blood, no whispers of a creature that didn't die, no accounts of shifting tunnels or sentient shadows. The official story was clean, concise, and utterly devoid of the truth. The site was sealed, declared off-limits, deemed too unstable for further investigation. A cover-up meticulously crafted to bury not just the tunnels, but the horrifying truth within them. I spent 3 months in a military medical facility in Landstuhl, Germany. The doctors there, a dedicated but bewildered team, ran countless tests. My physical injuries eventually healed, but the internal changes were harder to explain. They discovered a mild mutation in my blood, a strange type of accelerated cellular regeneration, an anomaly that defied their understanding. They chalked it up to reaction to environmental radiation, a convenient catch-all for anything they couldn't explain in a combat zone. But I knew it wasn't radiation. It was something else, something from that ancient darkness, something that had touched me, tainted me, and refused to let go. The mutation was subtle, almost imperceptible. Cuts healed faster, fatigue was easier to push through. But it came at a cost. A constant chill in my bones, a lingering metallic taste in my mouth, and the black vein-like marks that faded but never entirely disappeared. They remained, faint reminders, a living map of the horror I had endured. The psychological scars were far deeper. From the moment I returned, sleep became a luxury I rarely afforded. I couldn't sleep for more than 2 hours at a stretch. The darkness brought whispers, soft, insidious voices that seemed to slither into my mind, speaking in that alien guttural language I had heard in the chamber. When I closed my eyes, I saw them. Those pure, bone-white eyes, unblinking, staring at me from the inside of my own head. They were always there, a constant, chilling presence that clawed at the edges of my sanity. I tried to tell my story. I recorded a detailed report, trying to articulate the impossible, the unspeakable. But my superiors, the cold, practical men of command, dismissed it. The report was sealed, classified Level X, eyes only, buried deep within the military archives. Days later, I received a summons from the Advanced Biohazard Division. They wanted me to sign a non-disclosure agreement, a lifetime contract of silence promising never to speak of what I had seen, what I had experienced. They offered me a blank check, a quiet life, anything I wanted. I refused. I couldn't. Not when the whispers were so loud, not when the white eyes were always watching. That same night, I heard them, Footsteps outside my apartment door. Not human steps. Too light, too quick. A soft scuttling sound that sent shivers down my spine. I gripped my service pistol, but nothing appeared. The next morning, the news hit me like a sledgehammer. Morales, PFC Morales. His body had been found in a train station in Berlin. Dry, desiccated, not a drop of blood. Just like Miller. Just like the others. It was then I understood. We hadn't destroyed it. The creature wasn't a physical being in the way we understood. It was ancient, yes, a parasitic entity of faith and fear. It used flesh as a host, a temporary vessel, but it lived in the mind, in the shadow of those who saw it, those who carried its mark. It lived in the memory, in the fear it inspired. It had followed me. It was still out there. It was still hungry. And it was coming for me. 18 years. 18 long, agonizing years since that mission, since the hell of Al-Qarya al-Maut. I'd spent them trying to outrun the whispers, outrun the white eyes, outrun the chilling knowledge that it was still out there, and a piece of it was likely still in me. I lived in a small, isolated cabin, in the vast, unforgiving wilderness of Alaska, where the sun shines almost 24 hours a day in summer, and the nights are endless in winter. I kept the lights on, always. A desperate, futile attempt to push back the encroaching shadows. The mutation the doctors spoke of had become more pronounced. My reflection. It didn't blink. I'd noticed it years ago, a subtle, terrifying detail that would send a fresh wave of panic through me every time I caught my own gaze in a mirror. My eyes, dark and haunted, would stare back, unblinking, while the rest of me felt the unconscious flicker of my eyelids. It was a constant, chilling reminder that I was no longer entirely myself, that something ancient and alien had left its indelible mark. I lived with a constant paranoia, my senses hyper-alert, always scanning the periphery for movement, for shadows that stretched too long, for the faint metallic scent of iron on the wind. I made small cuts on my skin sometimes, just to watch the blood well up, to feel the familiar warmth, just to confirm that I still bled. Sometimes, especially when the whispers were louder, or the white eyes more vivid, the cuts would remain dry, bloodless, for a terrifying second, before my mutated cells kicked in, forcing the crimson liquid to appear. Those were the moments that pushed me closest to the edge. I'd spent years meticulously, dangerously digging through every covert file, every obscure historical text I could get my hands on. Using my old contacts, trading favors, bypassing military security, I pieced together fragments of the truth. I found mentions of an ancient Persian cult from the 4th century, the Ajdahak. They worshipped an entity they called Namtaru, the breath that steals blood. The texts described Namtaru as a primordial parasite, a being that slept beneath the desert sands, guarded by warriors sealed with fire. If awakened, it had to feed on the living to return to its slumber. We, my squad, we were the fools who had awakened it. We were the inadvertent priests of its terrible resurrection. The knowledge brought no peace, only a deeper, more profound dread. Namtaru wasn't just a monster. It was a force of nature, an ancient horror from a time before humanity. And it had tasted us. My isolated life in Alaska was a desperate attempt to outrun the inevitable, to hide in the vastness of the wild. I hunted, fished, and chopped wood, trying to ground myself in the tangible, in the rhythm of the natural world. But the natural world felt increasingly alien, warped by the unseen presence that clung to me. Then, 3 days ago, it arrived. A letter. No sender's address, just my name, handwritten in a spidery, unsettling script that made my skin crawl. The postmark was from an obscure military mail drop in Kandahar, Afghanistan. My hands trembled as I opened it, my heart hammering against my ribs. Inside, there was a single photograph. It was a satellite image, grainy but unmistakable, the entrance to the sealed tunnels of Al-Qarya al-Maut, the very spot where our nightmare had begun. But it wasn't just the ruins that chilled me to the bone. There were new marks on the stone, fresh carvings that looked eerily like the symbols we had seen in the tunnels. Eyes, broken moons, twisting lines. They weren't there 18 years ago. Someone or something had been back. Below the image, scrawled in thick dark ink, was a single terrifying phrase. "It's still hungry." I felt a cold dread clamp around my throat, squeezing the air from my lungs. It was a message, a warning, a promise. Namtaru was awake, or it was stirring, and it remembered me. I jammed the letter and the photograph into a rusted metal box, hiked deep into the frozen wilderness, and buried it under a layer of permafrost, hoping to entomb the terror with ice. It was a futile gesture, I knew, but a desperate act of defiance. I spent the next 2 nights with a rifle in my lap, staring out the window into the endless twilight of the Alaskan summer. The sun, usually a comforting presence, felt mocking now, its light too weak to penetrate the pervasive dread. The whispers grew louder, clearer, forming coherent phrases in that ancient guttural language, just at the edge of my comprehension. They spoke of hunger, of coming home, of a final meal. This morning, the air outside my cabin felt heavy, unnaturally still. Despite the usual brisk Alaskan breeze, the familiar scent of pine and damp earth was replaced by something else. That metallic tang. Iron. Blood. My blood ran cold. I gripped my rifle, my knuckles white, and slowly, cautiously, I opened the heavy wooden door of my cabin. There they were. Footprints. Bare. Human. They led from the dense spruce forest that fringed my property, across the dew-kissed moss and gravel, right up to my front door. They were distinct, clear, perfectly formed, but they weren't mine. They weren't animal. They were too long, too slender, with unnaturally splayed toes. And they were deep, as if the person who made them was impossibly heavy or impossibly strong. They stopped, not at the steps, not at the threshold. They stopped precisely at the edge of my porch, directly in front of my door, as if the maker had simply vanished into thin air, or stepped directly through the wood, or as if they had been waiting, right there, watching. The air around me suddenly smelled overpoweringly of iron. And this time, the sun, which had been a constant, unblinking presence for days, didn't rise. The sky remained a sickly, bruised twilight, the horizon refusing to lighten, the world held in a perpetual, terrifying dawn that never broke. The whispers in my head coalesced into a single, terrifying thought, clearer than any I had ever heard. It's here. The hunt had finally come full circle. The perpetual twilight that clung to the Alaskan sky was a suffocating blanket, sealing off the world in a horrifying, endless pre-dawn. The air, heavy with the metallic tang of iron, pressed down on me, making every breath a struggle. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum in the absolute stillness. The bare footprints leading to my door, then abruptly vanishing, were not just a threat. They were a profound, chilling violation. It had been here. It was here. I slammed the cabin door shut, the thick wood a pathetic barrier against the ancient evil I knew lurked just beyond. My hands were shaking so violently I almost couldn't chamber a round in my rifle. The whispers in my head, once insidious and vague, were now a cacophony of guttural syllables, forming coherent sentences in that alien language, a language I still didn't understand, but whose meaning resonated with terrifying clarity. Hunger, mine, yours, ours. I moved through my cabin, a shadow in the deepening gloom, checking every window, every corner. The familiar comfort of my home, my sanctuary, was utterly gone, replaced by a suffocating sense of intrusion. Every creak of the old wood, every rustle of the wind outside, sounded like the soft scuttling of something impossibly light, impossibly fast. My eyes darted to my reflection in the darkened window. It stared back, unblinking. And this time, its eyes were not just mine, haunted and tired. There was a flicker of something else, a cold, predatory gleam of pure white deep within the pupils, A terrifying, fleeting moment where my own eyes seemed to burn with the same ancient, hungry light as Namtaru's. It wasn't just outside. It was inside. Inside me. It had been there since the tunnels, a seed of corruption, a fragment of its essence that had clung to me, growing, waiting. The accelerated healing, the unblinking reflection, the whispers. They weren't just scars. They were symptoms. I was not merely being hunted. I was being harvested. The cabin grew colder, an unnatural chill that seeped into my bones, a cold that drained the warmth from the very air. The scent of iron intensified, making my head swim. I felt a growing weakness, a profound lethargy, as if my own life force was being slowly, subtly drawn out of me, through the black marks that pulsed faintly beneath my skin, now more prominent than ever. I clutched my rifle, a hollow comfort, a useless weapon against a parasitic entity that defied flesh and bone. What did you shoot when the enemy was a concept, a shadow, a hunger that lived in the mind? How do you fight what is already a part of you? A soft scratching sound came from the floorboards beneath my feet, not outside, inside. Then another, a scuttling, dragging sound, as if something was moving just under the wood, trying to get in, or trying to get out. My breath hitched in my throat. My gaze dropped to the floor, to the faint, almost imperceptible outlines of the floorboards, dark with age. And I saw it. Faint marks, like scratches, no. Like elongated, slender fingers, tracing patterns on the wood, right from beneath where I stood. The creature hadn't just reached my door. It had entered. It had burrowed. It had been here all along, growing in the fertile ground of my fear, feeding on my life, manifesting itself through the very structure of my sanctuary. The cabin wasn't safe. I wasn't safe. Nowhere was safe. My reflection in the window seemed to smirk, a lipless, terrible smile that stretched its features into a parody of my own. The white eyes burned brighter. It was no longer a flicker. It was a full, terrifying possession. The whispers roared in my head, a chorus of triumphant ancient voices, all speaking of the same terrible thing, the return, the feast, the awakening. I raised my rifle, aiming at the window, at my own corrupted reflection. A desperate final act, a soldier's last stand against an enemy he could not comprehend, could not defeat. But even as my finger tightened on the trigger, a profound weariness washed over me. A calm, chilling acceptance. What was the point? It wasn't just external. It was already in, and it had won. The metallic taste in my mouth became unbearable, the scent of iron thick and cloying. The whispers faded, replaced by a single resonant hum, a vibration that resonated from the depths of my being. My vision blurred, the cabin around me blurring into a kaleidoscope of shifting shadows. The last thing I saw, as my body swayed, as my grip on the rifle slackened, was the reflection in the window. My face. But the eyes were entirely white now. Pure, luminous, unblinking white. The sun never rose that day in Alaska. And somewhere, deep beneath the scorching sands of Iraq, the ancient tunnels of Al-Qarya al-Maut seemed to exhale a long, satisfied breath. If this story sent shivers down your spine, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more chilling tales. Drop a comment below, hit that like button, and let me know which city or country you're watching from. Your support keeps the nightmares alive.